David Phelps has spoken publicly about many things across his career: his voice, his family, the grace that has sustained his ministry through difficult seasons. But there is one night he has named, without hesitation, as the performance he would take back. It was not a small regional date or an early career stumble from before he found his footing. It happened on one of gospel music's biggest stages, in front of a capacity crowd that had come specifically to hear him, surrounded by the Gaither family of artists who knew his voice better than almost anyone alive. The audience that night walked away satisfied. What they never saw was what David carried offstage when the applause stopped, and what it took him years to say out loud. Stay with us through this video, because what he revealed about that night, and what it tells us about the man behind the voice, is the part of this story the gospel community has been circling for years without ever landing on directly. We reach it together at the 10-minute mark, and it is worth the journey. David Wayne Phelps grew up in Tomball, Texas, inside a Christian faith tradition where singing was not a performance art so much as a spiritual discipline, something practiced with the full self, not only the voice. He studied seriously at Baylor University, trained a tenor range that sits in a category by itself in Southern gospel music, and when Bill Gaither extended an invitation to join the Gaither Vocal Band in 1997, the answer David gave changed the character of Christian music for the next 2 decades. What followed is the career most fans know deeply and well: the recordings, the homecoming concerts, the television specials, and the moments, and there were many of them, when David's voice did something on a stage that caused several thousand people to simultaneously stop breathing for a second and then not know quite what to do with themselves. His recording of End of the Beginning became the song that reshaped how countless listeners thought about resurrection and what it means to believe in something eternal. His delivery of Via Dolorosa, the song tracing Christ's walk toward Calvary, produced a quality of silence in auditoriums that is different from ordinary quiet, the kind that comes from people being genuinely stopped by what they are hearing, unable to move until the last note finishes. For the millions of fans who built their faith lives alongside the Gaither Homecoming video series through the 1,990 seconds and early 2,000 seconds, David was not simply a featured voice in a singing group. He was embedded in the soundtrack of their most personal spiritual memories. Families played his recordings at funerals. Couples associate his voice with the years they were raising children in the church. People will tell you, without embarrassment, that something David sang at a specific moment gave them something they had been searching for and could not name on their own. That is the relationship his audience brings into every concert, every recording, every song. And understanding the weight of that relationship is the only way to understand why the night he named as his one regret carries the meaning it does. The Gaither Homecoming concerts reached their widest cultural reach somewhere in the early 2000 seconds, filling arenas across the country with audiences drawn by a mixture of nostalgia, genuine faith, and the extraordinary collection of voices Gaither had assembled around him across 30 years of ministry. These were not casual evenings. People planned travel around them, drove several hours to attend, and brought family members who needed the specific kind of testimony that Southern gospel music delivers with that particular combination of joy and weight. David was one of the central voices in those years, alongside Guy Penrod, Mark Lowry, and others who defined what those evenings sounded like at their most powerful. The pressure attached to that position was real, even if most fans never thought to frame it that way. When thousands of people arrive expecting a specific thing from a specific voice, when the anticipation in the room is built around notes that only one person in the building can reliably reach, the singer standing at the center of that expectation carries something that does not dissolve when the music starts. David has spoken honestly across various conversations over the years about the physical demands of sustaining a voice like his through an extended touring schedule. and about the discipline required to protect that voice through conditions that were not always cooperative. The years between 2002 and 2004 were full in ways that went beyond any single performance schedule. David was balancing Gaither commitments with the demands of his marriage to Lori and the raising of their children, navigating the specific difficulty of a life that looks extraordinary from the outside and is simply exhausting to actually live through, regardless of the blessings it contains. Voices under sustained pressure do not always announce their limits in advance. Sometimes the limit arrives mid-performance, mid-note, without warning, and the singer has to make a decision in a fraction of a second about what happens next. That decision is the center of the story David eventually told. What makes his telling of it different from a standard account of a difficult concert night is the framework he brought to it. And that framework is not primarily about singing at all. We are nearly there. Stay with us through one more turn in this story, because what David said about his own state of mind in the hours and days following that concert is the part that changes the way you hear everything that came before it. And this is where the story takes a turn that nobody in his circle expected him to make public. When David spoke openly about that homecoming concert, and the conversations where he addressed it most directly came during a season when he was working through questions about calling, about sustainability, about what it honestly means to carry someone else's spiritual experience on a stage night after night. What he named was not simply a bad vocal night. What he named was a choice. Partway through his featured number, with something going wrong in a section of the song that required everything he had, he made a real-time decision to push through rather than stop. He chose to protect what the audience believed about him rather than trust them with where he actually was. He described that decision, in his own reflection on it, as a form of pride. Not the aggressive kind, not arrogance, but the quieter variety that dresses itself as professionalism, as responsibility, as not wanting to disappoint people who traveled far and paid to be in that room. In the moment, he convinced himself that continuing was the right thing to do. Looking back across the years since, he came to believe it was not. What made it a genuine regret, and what separates this from an ordinary story about vocal fatigue, was what David admitted about his spirit during that performance. He was not simply managing a physical challenge in isolation from everything else happening in his life. He was performing faith, singing words about grace and resurrection and the presence of God, from a place where the words and the feeling were not fully connected. The notes came out. The emotion was present enough to register on his face. But the interior place that the best gospel singing draws from, the place where the singer is not managing the performance but actually living inside it, that was not where he was standing that night. For an artist whose entire legacy rested on exactly that interior honesty, the distinction mattered in a way that no audience response could address. Bill Gaither has said, across decades of conversations about the nature of gospel music, that what separates a truly great gospel singer from a merely skilled one is transparency, the willingness to let something real happen in front of people who came to witness it. David understood that conviction to his core, and by his own accounting, he had fallen short of it, not by singing poorly, but by singing carefully when the moment required something honest and unmanaged. The people who were present backstage that evening have reflected on it with the kind of care that comes from genuine love for someone. There was no visible failure. The crowd responded warmly. David walked off stage having delivered what most people in that arena would have called a strong performance. And he carried something private home with him that took years to fully surface. The period leading to his first extended departure from the Gaither Vocal Band around 2004, a break he described at the time as driven by the desire to be more present for his family, also contained this quieter reckoning, the one that had been building since that concert night, about what he was doing and why, and whether the way he had been doing it was serving anyone as honestly as it could. His faith framework for understanding that moment is one his longtime listeners will recognize immediately. He did not frame it as failure in the way the secular world assigns that word. He framed it as instruction, a reminder that the voice he had been given was not his to manage according to what audiences expected, but to steward with honesty, including and especially in the moments when honesty required more of him than a technically strong performance could deliver. Guy Penrod, who shared those homecoming stages with David through many of those years, has spoken broadly about the gap that exists in live performance between what an audience experiences and what the singer is actually carrying in a given moment. That gap, the one most performers choose to keep private, to protect both themselves and the people watching, was exactly what David chose to name. And naming it, he has said, was part of how he eventually came back to the stage differently. For those of us who have followed David's journey across more than 2 decades, through the recordings and the arena concerts and the solo work and the seasons away and the return, what he shared about that night speaks to something larger than one performance on one evening. It speaks to the question every person of faith eventually encounters in their own way, which is the distance between what we present and what we actually feel, between the words we say in worship or prayer or testimony and the interior place we are standing when we say them. Gospel music carries a particular weight in that regard. The songs David sings are not entertainment in the way that word usually works. They are testimony, declarations about God, about eternity, about what Christian faith promises at the hardest moments of human experience. The people who fill those arenas and who have watched those homecoming recordings for 30 years bring something irreplaceable into the room with them. They bring their trust. They bring the memory of hospital rooms and funerals and seasons of doubt where this music was the thing that held when nothing else did. What David's honesty about that night tells us is that he understood what was in the room, and that the regret he carried was never about the notes or what the recording sounded like in playback. It was about the people in those seats and what he owed them, not as a performer, but as someone who had accepted, in accepting this calling, the responsibility to mean what he sang in front of a room full of people who needed it to be real. That willingness to hold himself to a standard most people would never impose on him from the outside is part of what has kept his music meaningful across a career spanning more than 20 years of Christian music. If you have been a fan since the original Homecoming days, you already know that his voice has always been the least important thing about him. The voice is extraordinary, nobody would argue otherwise. But the man behind the voice, the one willing to sit with his own regret and say it in public, is the reason the connection between David Phelps and his audience is what it is. Leave a comment below and tell us whether you attended any of those homecoming arena concerts in that era and what those evenings meant to your own faith journey. Those conversations matter to this community, and we read every one of them. There is one more part of this story that most people have not yet connected, and it runs through the relationship between David and Bill Gaither specifically. A relationship that is, by every account, one of the most significant of David's professional life, and one that carries its own layer of meaning around exactly the question David chose to name. Bill Gaither built the homecoming world on a specific conviction. He did not want polished, manufactured performance. When the original homecoming videos began in 1901, born out of a casual reunion at his home in Alexandria, Indiana, the cameras were deliberately catching people mid-conversation, mid-laugh, singing without preparation, responding to each other without choreography. The philosophy behind it was direct. Authenticity was the only thing that lasted in gospel music. Technique served the song, but honesty served the listener. And Bill had spent decades learning the difference. David arrived in 1997 into something Bill had been building toward that ideal for a very long time. What Bill recognized in David What people close to that ministry say Bill articulated across many years of working together was not simply a remarkable tenor. It was David's capacity for emotional transparency in performance. The thing Bill saw and valued above the extraordinary range was the willingness to mean the words, which makes the weight of that concert night, and David's eventual naming of it, something that lands differently when you understand the world it happened inside. The one performance David would take back took place inside the very world built on the conviction that meaning the words was the entire point. And the fact that he chose to say so publicly, that he brought honesty to the memory of a night where honesty had felt too costly in the moment, is its own form of honoring what the homecoming world was built to be. When David returned to the Gaither Vocal Band in 2009, after several years away, the people who knew him closely noticed something that did not change the voice, but changed how it was carried. He seemed to be offering the music more openly, holding it more lightly, less concerned with protecting the performance, and more fully present inside the song. Whether that shift traces back specifically to the night he has named as his one regret is something only David can answer. But the timing fits, and the arc of it fits. And the David Phelps who has continued to sing through the years since, through the concerts and recordings and the conversations about calling and humility, reflects someone who found something real in a night that looked like success from where the audience was sitting. Whatever comes next for David and his ministry, the gospel community that has followed his story across these decades watches with the kind of affection that comes from a long and honest shared history. The voice is still there. The calling is still there. And the man has grown into someone willing to say the harder things in public, which is rarer than an extraordinary tenor range, and in the long run, considerably more worth knowing about. The question his story leaves open is worth sitting with quietly. Whether the concert he regrets most became, in the longer arc of his life and his faith, one of the nights that mattered most, not for what happened on that stage, but for what he carried home from it, and what he eventually chose to do with it. Whatever comes next, the people who have followed this ministry for decades already know one thing without needing to be told. David Phelps's story is not finished. And if this story moved you today, the next video in this series will as well. We have been working through the untold chapters behind the Gaither Homecoming era, and what came out of that research is every bit as human and unexpected as what you heard today.